Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today's video is going to be something which I hope is really interesting to you. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be comparing Olympus's earliest 35mm full-frame SLR cameras. And this is going to be, of course, the Olympus FTL and the Olympus M1, which are quite hard to find cameras outside Japan and which probably more than a few of you have never seen. Before I go any further, for those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras like these here on my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I have an Etsy store which is also called Japan Vintage Camera, so if you'd like to buy one of these cameras or another vintage camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So, Olympus was a very big camera manufacturer back in the day, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And a lot of people don't believe it when I say that they didn't introduce a full-frame 35mm SLR camera until 1970. It's kind of odd because the other makers, Pentax, Minolta, Canon, Nikon, were all producing SLR cameras in the 1950s. Olympus was quite late to the game, and mainly because of the success of their other models. They had a really good successful line of half-frame cameras. Their pin camera, which came out in 1958, was kind of like a Grand Slam home run for them. They sold lots and lots of those cameras, and the half-frame format was quite popular through the 1960s. And they made an SLR camera in the half-frame format, known as the Pin F or FT or FV. There were a few different variations. But by 1970, it was becoming clear that the half-frame format was, the interest was kind of waning out in it. Now they had like the smaller 110 film cameras, which were, the Kodak and other makers were going to make, so that there wasn't much of a future for the half-frame format. And obviously people were moving up to the 35mm SLR. It was the camera which the pros were using, and people, as it tends to happen, what pros tend to gravitate down to the ordinary people who dream of shooting like pros, which is one of the reasons I got my first SLR camera. So Olympus decided that they had to have a 35mm full-frame SLR camera to sell. And so they came up with a couple of different approaches. Now, it's kind of interesting. You can kind of see the two completely different trains of thought, which were, I guess, being piloted around or driven around Olympus at the time. And one idea was to go, the safe and conventional route and make a camera similar to what everyone else was making. And then the other route was to do something completely different and hopefully try to make, their own niche market, or hopefully something more than a niche, to take a different approach which would turn to be popular. And there were kind of risks to both approaches. First, if you're making something everyone else is making, then why should they buy your particular version of it? And and that was but that was kind of still the safe bet, because getting a small part of a popular and well-known market is better than having no part. And this camera looked enough and operated enough like the other cameras which were similar to it, that Olympus thought that this might be a viable design. And the FTL, if you look at it, it looks very much like the other cameras, the Canon FT series, or a little bit like the Nicomat cameras, and much like the Minolta SR cameras. And with the exception of the Nikon ones, like the Minolta and Pentax or Canon, they're also similar, that if you use one of these cameras, you can pretty much use all of them, because everything is laid out the exact same way. But on the other hand, it was thought that maybe the market was going in the wrong way, that engineers were kind of thinking the wrong way, and that if you came up with something which was newer and better and people liked it, then you would get a larger share of the market. And that's what Olympus was also thinking with the M1 camera. And the difference also between these two cameras was the people who were heading the design teams. Now, no one remembers who headed the design team which was responsible for the FTL camera, mainly because this camera was a huge flop and was produced for less than a year before they stopped making it. And unfortunately for the people who worked on this camera, their names are kind of lost to history, whereas the designer of the M1 camera was none other than Mr. Yoshihisa Maitani himself. And Maitani was, even at that time, kind of a legend among designers and engineers here in Japan, where there were lots of legendary designers and engineers. He was the one who invented the first pen half-frame format camera, which is what brought Olympus from a regular camera maker into the mainstream. Olympus didn't disappear like so many of the Japanese makers did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They continued to be popular and have an ever larger market share, largely due to the designs of Mr. Maitani. Not only was he responsible for the pin half-frame format camera, he was responsible also for the pin F half-frame SLR cameras, which were quite popular, especially as medical cameras, because Olympus was a big medical supply manufacturer. But this was his most, significant contribution to SLR photography and to Olympus, and it was the M1 camera, which is better known to people around the world as the OM camera. So right away you can kind of see the difference in the cameras. The FTL camera is quite a bit larger than the M1 camera. The controls are very conventional on the FTL camera. They're much different here on the M1 camera. So as I said, the FTL camera, it was produced for 1 year and then it kind of was sent off to the wayside, and the M1 took all the limelight and evolved into the OM1, OM2, 3, 4, and all the other OM cameras, which continued into production all the way up until the year 2000. So there were a couple of good reasons for the failure of the FTL. The first reason was it just wasn't unique. There was nothing here to make people want it more than they would want a Canon FT or a Minolta SRT. And so, and those cameras were already selling well, and they already had a pretty good system and a following behind them. So there wasn't much of a chance for for people just to move over to it just because it was an Olympus camera. And also, this camera featured a very quirky screw mount lens design. This one used an odd M42 mount lens with a release button here and an alignment notch on the lens itself. And by 1970, the screw mount lenses were already obsolete. They weren't being used on rangefinder cameras or SLR cameras. Olympus, didn't want, thought that, they didn't, have the budget to market a large assortment of lenses for the FT series. So they decided by using the M42 mount, then not only, they wouldn't have to produce too many lenses because there were so many M42 mount lenses on the market. You could use a Pentax lens, you could use old Yashica lenses, or the wide variety which were available at the time. But, that's kind of a silly thing, because not only do you make money from selling cameras, you make money from selling lenses. So the entire concept behind the Olympus FTL was just faulty to begin with. And also, the design itself wasn't very good. Now, I don't come across a lot of FTL cameras. They're quite rare. They were produced for less than a year. They weren't popular, not many were made. And another, one of the big problems behind these cameras is they weren't very reliable. And it's not often that I find one of these. I very rarely find an FTL, even here in Japan. And even more rarely do I find one which still works. But in the case of this one, I was quite happy because I got this camera with a 50mm f1.4 lens, which is quite rare, with the original lens cap and the case, and this camera still completely works. The shutter and meter and everything are still quite wonderful in it. But this is one of the exceptions to the rule when it comes to the FTL. It just simply wasn't a very well engineered camera. And Mr. Maitani, being a legendary engineer in a country famous for engineers, of course something that he was going to work on was going to be quite well made. And of course the Olympus M1 and OM series has stood the test of time. Now you can see the obvious difference in size. There's a big difference in weight. There's also a difference in the sound of the cameras. If I'll go ahead and face them so they're the same distance. There's a significant difference in the sound of the cameras. The OM1 is a little bit quieter and a little bit softer. And what it reminds me of, and this will probably give away how old I am, this reminds me of the sound of the IBM Selectric typewriter. And I always liked the sound of that typewriter because it was just like precision engineering, the sound that a precision machine makes when it's being operated. And the M1 camera and OM cameras have that sound, whereas This has more of the sound of like a cheap Brother typewriter. You know, the kind that you know, your dad used in school and then gave to you, 20 years later. So a big difference in the sound of the camera, the smoothness of the camera, the weight balance, and everything. So Maitani decided that rather than go the conventional route, and this camera was already dying by the time that the M1 was being marketed. He decided to do the opposite of what other makers were doing, and rather than go with a very heavy, like M60 machine gun type of camera, which was rugged, durable, and you could roll down cliffs and stuff like that, he decided that maybe people didn't want to carry around something that weighed like as much as a concrete brick around their neck all the time, and would want something a little bit smaller and quieter and easier to handle. And when he designed this camera, he designed it next to a Leica M series rangefinder camera. And if you look at the dimensions of this camera and the weight and balance, you find that they're very similar. And I don't know if I did a video where I compared, I know I took some photos some years ago when I was comparing my old M4 to my old OM3, and they were pretty much identical. And and oddly, unfortunately, I got rid of the M4. I should have kept that camera, but yeah, that was the idea behind the design. A nice, lightweight, compact camera designed for shooting professionals, and which would have a long lifespan. Now, when it comes to a camera like this with an M42 mount, which is already obsolete, and a design which has already borrowed, most of its technology from the 1950s, you have to kind of think what you're going to do with this camera design over the years. And a camera like this, there's really not much of or anything you can do with it, because when it's already obsolete when you're making it, what is the point? Whereas when Maitani designed this camera, he designed it looking ahead, knowing that you would have to make a camera which would be like forward compatible with a lot of other things which Olympus planned to manufacture for these cameras. So an odd thing with this camera, if you open the back here, it has a removable film door, which is kind of odd. When this camera was released, there were no accessories and there was no reason to remove the film door. There weren't any data or other type of film backs available for this camera in 1971, but they were thinking ahead to the time. They already had, other makers were experimenting with things like data backs and information imprinting backs, and so even though they hadn't had any of these really in the design line yet, they decided that they wanted to have it available as an option in the future. So they designed the camera so it would accept it. This camera here doesn't have an attachment for a power winder or motor drive, but it's easily modifiable. And when the camera was designed, it was designed with components inside which could be easily modified to accept later upgrades. And a lot of the old M1 cameras I find, and there weren't a lot of these produced either before they were changed to the OM series, have been converted to accept power winders or motor drives. And other things. The light meter system in this camera, I really like the way it's laid out. It sets in behind the prism here, and it kind of reads through through the lens light meter system, which was improved later on to off the film systems. But everything about this camera was designed with thinking toward the future and making it something which would be a lasting design. And it was successful in that. As I said, the OM series cameras were produced all the way up until the last model, which was called the OM 2000, which obviously was manufactured for the year 2000. So which camera is the best? I don't know. If you have a working camera here, FTL, if you're lucky enough to find one of these, which are they're incredibly scarce, it's still a wonderful camera. The lenses, even though this is an M42 mount lens, there's some similarity in the design of the optics of the lens. They are assembled differently and a different aperture actuation system, but excellent lenses when you find the original lenses. And if you have old M42 mount lenses, which a lot of people have hanging around and which you can find on eBay or whatever for next to nothing, it's a good platform for shooting with different lenses. And this is probably the most modern mainstream camera. Of course, there were later Petri cameras and Voigtlander cameras which came with the M42 mount, but this was the last, I guess, what was intended to be a real mainstream M42 mount camera. So a good foundation for that. But as I said, finding a working and reliable model is difficult. So quirks which these cameras have, the issue with the Olympus cameras, the old ones, if you come across an old M1 like this, the prism deteriorates. There's protective foam which is put under the metal cover on top of the prism. It dry rots and the chemicals react with the coating on the prism and cause it to get black spots. And this camera is suffering from that, but fortunately the prism isn't that hard to replace. Other than that, this is a very rock solid and reliable camera, and it's very rare that I come across a dead M1 or OM1 camera which can't be simply brought back to life with a minimal amount of work. In the case of the FTL camera, that's difficult. The shutter curtain material in these cameras is kind of primitive, kind of like the stuff which Pentax was using in the 1950s. And when it works well, but the issue is that the shutter curtains get hard and they don't turn easily. And that causes the shutter curtains not to close all the way and can cause the mirror to stick up. And whenever I see these cameras listed for sale on the rare occasions they come up, they usually say, mirror up is stuck. And usually, sometimes you can fix it if the shutter curtains aren't too bad. You can lubricate the curtain drums, and you can add a little bit more tension to the curtain rollers, and then it'll start working again. But most of the time, short of replacing the shutter curtains, it's not going to work. From a collector's standpoint, this is a really cool camera. It's a really interesting piece of Olympus history and something which is likely going to appreciate in value. The Olympus M1 is already appreciating quite much highly in value compared to what they were going for a few years ago. These were only produced for 1 year, not even a full year, before they had to change the name and redesign the camera. This is basically 99% or maybe 97% the same as an Olympus OM1. The only difference between these cameras is pressure plate is smaller for the film back here. It's something you can see. It's a little bit longer on the later OM series cameras. And there's a little bit of a difference in the construction of the light meter cell on the inside. But other than that, everything interchanges between the OM1 and the M1. Maitani really wanted to call this camera the M1, and it was kind of Olympus gave them permission. It was mainly because his name started with an M. But of course, in business, I guess in the world back then, it's just as silly as it is today. In Leica, of all people, the company which Maitani probably worshipped over anyone else, didn't like Olympus using the M1 name on their camera because Leica was using it for one of their own models. So Olympus, I guess not ruffle their feathers, stopped the production of the camera. They changed it to OM1. They didn't export any of these from Japan. These were only sold on the local market. And when the camera was reintroduced a few months later with the larger film pressure plate and a few other small changes, it became the OM1, which became such a big hit for Olympus. But anyway, that's it for my comparison between the first Olympus 35mm full-frame SLR cameras. I'll be having this camera listed here shortly, the FTL, for someone who wants a really rare and interesting Olympus camera. This M1 here, I still need to do a significant amount of work to it. It works and everything, but unfortunately I need to replace the prism in it and you do a little bit of adjusting to it to get it back, to get it ship shape. But when I have it ready, I'll also have it listed. So please check my stores if you're interested. And I'll be doing more videos like this. I'm trying to get out at least one video a week, and those of you who watch regularly probably have noticed that. If you want to see more, please subscribe, and if you like the video, please like it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.